Thank you so much for staying with Monday Special. Remember, the hashtag is Monday Special KE. You can text us on 22422. Now, today marks World Diabetes Day, and with over 775,000 people living with diabetes in Kenya, there's concern over lifestyle choices that are bringing those numbers up. Likewise, hypertension continues to affect thousands of Kenyans. So on Monday Special tonight, we'd like to sample your questions throughout the show. Once again, talk to us across our social media platforms, 22422. You can text us, leave your name and location, use the hashtag Monday Special KE on Twitter, and of course follow us on @Citizen TV Kenya on Facebook. Let me introduce you now to my panelists before we delve into that discussion. We have Dr. Mohammed Jailan, I should say a friend of Monday Special. He's been here once or twice, a cardiologist based at the Aga Khan University Hospital. And then we have Dr. Eric Njenga, who is a diabetologist. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. Dr. Jailan, can I start with you? If you could just briefly give us an overview of what lifestyle diseases are.
Well, the spectrum of disease and the conditions that humans suffer has changed over the centuries, and now we're finding conditions that we bring upon on ourselves. These are what we call lifestyle diseases, diseases which are brought about by the way we live. And broadly speaking, these are taking over. They're becoming much more important. They're becoming more dominant, and we're seeing and predicting that certainly in this part of the world, over the next 15 to 20 years, more people will be dying as a result of lifestyle choices than perhaps over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. If you think about the key decisions that we make in terms of the way we live, you would have the diet that we take, how much activity we participate in, how overweight or underweight we choose to be because of some of the decisions related to diet and activity, and key things that are associated with addiction like cigarette smoking and alcohol. And the combination of these 5 areas is particularly pertinent, and you're finding more and more diseases are more related to one of these 5 key areas.
All right, and broad as it is, I suppose there's always a focus on hypertension. Where does hypertension fall when you talk about lifestyle diseases? That is, where exactly does it fall?
So, well, the first thing to say about hypertension is it is extremely common. Maybe 1 out of 3 Kenyans above the age of 30 has hypertension. The second thing to say about hypertension is that it is associated with death. And it is more associated with death than cigarette smoking, than diabetes, than being overweight or underweight, than taking alcohol, than actually taking part in unprotected sex. So in all the spectrum of potential conditions that may put you at risk, hypertension is expected to be the biggest associated killer, if you like, certainly in the Western world and increasingly so in this part of the world.
All right, we'll come to those questions. Already a lot of questions coming in about that. Dr. Njenga, it's World Diabetes Day. What's the most important message you want to talk to Kenyans about today, World Diabetes Day?
Okay. So today being World Diabetes Day, the biggest problem that we have is a rising surge in diabetes. So currently the global prevalence stands at around 415 million people living with diabetes, which translates to 1 in every 11. But in Africa, the sad statistic is about 2/3 of all people who are diabetic are walking around with diabetes and do not know even that they have diabetes. So 2/3 are actually undiagnosed. So the big message you want to put across is that screening for diabetes is actually what is really important. Because you're able to capture people who may not be diabetic, for example, but are pre-diabetic, meaning their blood sugar levels are abnormal, but have not gone to the stage where you can classify them as being diabetes.
All right.
These individuals, simply by just putting in simple lifestyle measures, which include exercise and also making dietary changes, you can actually reverse back to having normal sugars.
So a change in lifestyle again.
Yeah.
All right, at this point I think I'd like to start asking some of the questions that have come in. I know we have some Facebook posts that had come in earlier. Let's see if we can bring those up. Some of them may be sporadic across diabetes and hypertension, but let's try and answer as many. Gloria Ada says, is excessive mental straining the main reason for pressure? How can one know he or she is having pressure? So she's asking about pressure. I think I can turn this to you. I suppose there's a link there to stress and a link to heart disease. That's just my guess, because she keeps talking about pressure. What can you tell us about the link between pressure and stress and heart disease?
Well, I think hypertension has got lots and lots of different things that can affect it, and just drinking coffee, for instance, can raise your blood pressure. Stress.
I drink a lot of coffee. Let's just pause there. So,
yes.
So when you say that, what should people who are coffee drinkers, avid coffee drinkers, keep in mind?
Well, I'll give you an example. If your blood pressure is measured 20 or 30 minutes after you've had a cup of coffee, the measurement that we'll read in the office will be about 10 or 15 millimeters of mercury higher. So if you're drinking coffee every day and your body hasn't adjusted, and you're doing this 4 or 5 times a day, then for 4 or 5 times a day your blood pressure is possibly rising 10 or 15 millimeters of mercury, which is a significant number.
Okay.
Because for every 20 millimeter of mercury rise in your blood pressure, the chance of you dying doubles. Your mortality rate doubles for every 20 millimeter rise in blood pressure.
So what's the safe amount of coffee to take?
Well, it depends on your actual blood pressure. Coffee is relatively safe if you don't have very high blood pressure. And in fact, if your blood pressure is well controlled while you take coffee, it's okay. And coffee, if you're talking about stress, is sometimes used as a way of managing stress. There's some people who find it relaxing.
Relaxing, yeah.
And so there's a balance. It's very complex.
Okay.
And that's why lifestyle diseases are so complicated, because it's not just one or two specific things. It's not a virus that you get and then you get the disease. It's a complex interplay of many, many factors. And as they come together in different individuals, they have more they cause more problems than others.
All right. Before we continue with the Facebook messages, Kelvin here asks Dr. Njenga whether diabetes can be reversed.
Okay, so the key thing to understand is once you have diabetes, there's a misnomer that most people think that, for example, if I'm diagnosed to have diabetes, let me start with the definition. So it's if you take a fasting blood sugar level, that is after you've woken up in the morning and you check your blood sugar fasting in the morning, any value more than 7 confirms a diagnosis of diabetes. During the day, specifically let's say 2 hours after a meal, any blood sugar value of more than 11.1 confirms diabetes. Once you're confirmed to have diabetes, there are changes you can make to ensure that your blood sugar is well controlled, but you actually don't reverse diabetes.
You manage it throughout.
You manage it throughout. But if you are pre-diabetic, meaning that your blood sugar levels have not reached those values that I've talked about, you can actually make changes through exercise and diet, and you can actually go back to having normal blood sugar. So pre-diabetes is a reversible condition, but once you have diabetes, it's a lifelong condition which has to be managed. So even if you manage to control your blood sugar, if it's, let's say if you're a type 2 diabetic, you start off on insulin, and maybe the blood sugars come down and the insulin is withdrawn, and now you're on tablets, and maybe the blood sugars still are well controlled and you manage to get off the tablets, it doesn't mean you stop seeing your doctor, that you're cured. You still have to follow up with your doctor. All
right. We have so many questions to go through, so let's see how we can move this along. The Facebook post can come up again. This one is from Catherine Lebeau. Can you add weight from taking too many fruits because of the sugar in the fruits? Incidentally, this is a question that came from quite a few people about fruit salad. I think there's always a confusion around healthy eating. You see different articles every other day coming up with avoid this and take this, and then the following time they're reversing it. So what can you tell us, first of all, generally about diet and what's good, or what's a good mix and what's not a good mix, as briefly as you're able to?
Well, perhaps I'll answer that question. I can see Dr. Njenga's brought a plate that looks like a balanced meal plate, so I'll ask him to take over. But in terms of whether or not you can gain weight by eating too much fruit, the answer is yes. In general, you're supposed to control your food intake across all the food types. There are various food types, and I'll allow Dr. Njenga to describe them. But if you drink or take too much sugar, if you take too much fat, if you take too much protein, if you take too much of any one kind of food stuff, there is a chance that your body will allow that to translate into weight gain. And the specific diets actually designed to help you manage your weight by eliminating specific foodstuffs, particularly fat and sugar. So there's certain diets where you eliminate sugar completely, carbohydrate free diets, if you like, carb control diets, and they're actually a weight loss mechanism. But perhaps Dr. Njenga can eliminate us.
Yeah, Dr. Njenga, please, let's delve into that and just sort of give us a snapshot as to what a healthy diet is, whether it includes fruits, veggies, carbs. Let me see if I can hold that up.
So let's start with what is we call a proportioned diet in terms of how you serve you make the portions on your plate. So the upper half of the plate want to be completely consisting of vegetables. This could either be raw, steamed, or cooked, based on your preference. Then we have the lower half divided into two sections. So we have one quarter being the starch, the other quarter being the protein. Just on the protein, we preferably want more of the plant protein, the legumes, for example, peas and beans. Then the next category that we prefer is white meat, for example, chicken and fish. But the rule with chicken that the skin has to be removed because it's very rich in cholesterol. Then avoid deep frying. So, for example, what you get at the fast food outlets, where the fish and the chicken is deep fried, is not healthy because of a higher cholesterol content. Again, the amount of oil that you use to cook this food also has to be limited. And we prefer using liquid as compared to solid oil. For the starch portion, we preferably want to minimize to a single cup portion, or a rough estimate is to just simply make a fist, and this roughly equates to the maximum amount of starch that you'd want someone to serve on their plate.
All right, just before we move along, again, so the rule on fruits, and I think Dr. Jaylan has alluded to this, everything in moderation. So people enjoy their fruit salad, people enjoy their fruits every day. So what's the rule on eating fruits in a way that you won't gain weight?
Okay, so the key thing, we want to have about, ideally 5 portions, but we want to have them specifically as single pieces, for example. So let's start with, for example, people who are diabetic. One common mistake that people make is that they combine their main meals with the fruit portions. So for example, you have lunch, then immediately after you take a watermelon or pineapple. That now, you've already consumed carbohydrates in your main meal, and again you're going to add on more sugar, because the fruit itself it actually consists of simple sugar, which will be absorbed through the intestine. That has a tendency of making your blood sugar rise.
All right, so ideally, what do you do?
So ideally, you have your main meal, and your fruits come 2 hours after your main meal. So if you have breakfast at 7, your fruits come at 9. If you have lunch at 1 o'clock, your fruits come at 3. If you have dinner at 7, fruits come at 9 p.m.
So almost use them as a snack.
Use them as a snack. And always single portion, especially for diabetic patients. So another common mistake, people take different types of fruits, mix them up into a single bowl, like a pudding. That again has a likely tendency of significantly raising your blood sugar. Or again, blending several fruits together into a juice.
Into a juice. Very heartbreaking for me. Love all fruits. All right, let's see if we have more. So many questions coming up on SMS. I'll get to those in just a moment. Do we have more on Facebook? Yes, we do. And then we'll also sample Twitter. If I don't want... I believe Dr. Njaga has touched on this a little bit in terms of what foods one should avoid if they don't want diabetes, but I don't know whether you want to very briefly... You've already touched on that, right? The foods to avoid. Okay, Harrison in Nairobi say, if it's sugar-free, the sky is the limit. Is this true? I think that's also for you. So again, also, just like Dr. Jaylan has alluded, everything has to be done in proportion. So again, for example, Coke Zero, for example, may be sugar-free. So people think that I can have as much Coke Zero as I'd want to. But again, everything has to be in the proportion that are required. So sugar-free yogurt, sugar-free juices, for example, they can be consumed, but again, everything has to be done within proportion. Yes. Dr. Jaylan, there's a question here that a lot of people have been asking about smoking. So one of them is, can smoking be the one factor facilitating heart disease? The other one that has been asked a few times, mostly from young people, is smoking shisha. One of them said, that's how I socialize. I do it all the time, but I hear it's so bad for me, it can kill me. Are you able to just sort of talk a little bit about smoking, whether it's cigarettes or shisha, smoking and heart disease?
Sure. Before I do that, if you don't mind, I just want to add one little comment about food and diet, and this is really important. The amount of salt that we take as a nation is excessive, and we as Africans, native Africans, actually not very good at handling salt. So the more salt we take, it affects our blood pressure much more than it affects the blood pressure in other parts of the world. So salt management is really, really important. And
so what's the amount of salt for a day, in a day?
Well, you're supposed to take less than 2 teaspoons of salt. In fact, 1 teaspoon of salt in total per day is enough. But the problem is there's salt hidden everywhere. There's salt in the hot dog that you eat, there's salt in the bread that we take, there's salt in anything that's processed that we intake. There's salt in Coke Zero, for instance. So we have to be careful about that, because we're sensitive to salt as a race, and as a result it means that we are more sensitive to high blood pressure. But going back to smoking is absolutely a bad thing. There is no circumstance. It's not like alcohol, where a small amount of alcohol actually is a bit protective. Cigarette smoking, even one cigarette or passive smoking, is associated with a higher risk of lots of conditions. And we're not just talking about high blood pressure, because it can affect high blood pressure. We're talking about its effect on heart disease, its effect on all kinds of cancers, its effect on things like your voice, on your lungs, even, you know, impotence is associated with smoking. So cigarette smoking is extremely bad. And there's this myth that taking shisha, which is essentially smoke that's piped through water, that the water somehow extracts the nicotine and the other toxins, is absolutely incorrect. In fact, usually the proportions of tobacco that they put into the shisha is associated maybe between 5 and 100 times more toxins enter your lungs and enter your bloodstream from 1 hour of smoking shisha than from smoking a cigarette. So it's very important that people get this message that shisha is a really unhealthy habit, and whoever it is that's thinking twice about whether or not they can take this is doing the right thing. And the final thing about cigarettes is that cigarettes are extremely addictive. And addiction itself has a different and very important interplay when it comes to lifestyle diseases, because when you're addicted to something, then you're stuck. It's so difficult to extricate yourself from that addiction.
All right, thank you for clarifying that. Quite a few people have asked, especially about shisha, but like you're saying, just because it's packaged in a certain way doesn't mean it's any less harmful than the rest. Apparently we have a phone call as well. I suppose we can put that through. Okay, hello, you're through to Monday Special. Hello, are you on the line?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, what's your name and what's your question, please?
My name is Elizabeth Mweni.
Okay, Kabita.
Yeah, I'm calling from Nairobi.
Okay.
I'm asking what is diabetes and what are the foods which contribute to diabetes? Is it sugar content? Hello?
All right. All right, Tabitha, thank you so much for your call. Again, I think Dr. Njenga expanded on that at the very beginning of the show. I believe she asked what causes diabetes. I don't think we've touched on that. So very briefly, you can explain what.
Yeah. So diabetes as a condition is actually caused by the inability of the pancreas to either produce sufficient amounts of insulin, which will be used to control the blood sugar. So what insulin does, once it's produced, it actually acts like a key, enabling the blood glucose to actually enter into the cells and enabling us to control our blood sugar. So there are two main types of diabetes. We have what is called type 1 diabetes, occurs in the younger age group. So what happens is that their pancreas is completely destroyed by antibodies, and therefore they are left without any pancreatic reserve, so they're not able to produce any insulin. That's why people with type 1 diabetes from the get-go start off on insulin and remain on insulin for the rest of their life. Those with type 2 diabetes produce insulin, but it's not in sufficient amounts to control their blood sugar. They also don't have full pancreatic function, so at diagnosis, a diabetic patient has lost half of their pancreatic function, and during the course of the diabetes, that percentage continues to decline with time. And that's why people who have type 2 diabetes start off on using tablets to control their blood sugar, but eventually the tablets are not able to control the blood sugar because their pancreas now is completely unable to produce any insulin, and now they become fully dependent on insulin.
On the insulin. Two quick questions related to that. One, someone is asking whether using honey to replace it with sugar is a safe way of not becoming a diabetic. And the second one, someone is asking is, I'm diabetic, but can I use sweeteners in what I eat?
So, you know, sugar is sugar. So that's one concept that people have to understand. So whether it's in the form of bread, whether it's in the form of andoma, which people may think is healthier, whether it's in the form of honey, eventually at the level of the intestine, it's broken down into simple sugars, and that is absorbed. That goes into our bloodstream, and that causes our blood sugar to go up, regardless of the type of glucose component that it has actually come from. So what is actually replacing honey and sugar, for example, you're actually doing the same thing, because eventually that will still raise your blood sugar. But sweeteners, for example, are a good substitute for people who are diabetic. We do encourage them to use that. If you're diagnosed with diabetes and you've been used to taking tea with sugar, sweetener is a good substitute, because most of them don't have any calories. They are zero calories completely, so that will not raise your blood sugar.
All right. A very quick question before we go to Dr. Jaylan as well. He talked about at least a teaspoon of salt throughout the day. What's the rule for sugar? How much sugar is okay throughout the day?
Okay. So now if you're diabetic, we'd want you to come off sugar completely. Okay. So that's the first rule. So try and substitute that with a sweetener. For anyone else, you don't want to have an excess amount of sugar. So anything more than maybe just a teaspoon in your cup of tea should be sufficient. So you don't want to be taking in excess of that.
All right. Yeah. I have a question that I'll ask you in just a moment from Mary Perry in Kisumu, but I understand we have another caller on the line. If you can hear us, please tell me your name and your question.
Yeah, this is Jeremy from Nairobi.
Okay.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead with your question, please, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to know, is there any measures that are taken, let's say nationwide, where some foods that are causing these diseases can be banned? Like, we have talked a lot of Coca-Colas and all these kind of drinks that have a lot of sugar. So instead of maybe knowing that there's a danger, and then coming to inform people, some people understanding is low. Maybe you tell us today, but tomorrow we are going back to the same habit. Can there be a strategy to maybe, let's say we try to avoid such like companies that produce these foods that are having a lot of sugar and the components that can cause diabetes?
All right. Thank you for your question. Would you like to answer that? Or comment? Comment, I suppose.
Actually, no, it's an excellent question that you raise, and I think it's pertinent. Of course, we live in a free democracy, and people are allowed to make choices. But I think what we have to, as clinicians, and maybe the government also has to take some interest in, is at least making sure that people have information on which they can make their choices. This is a good setting in which we can share the information. But one of the things, the initiatives that they have in Europe and in North America is that they have labeling that gives you information about the content of carbohydrate, or content of lipids, of cholesterol, the content of salt, etc. in each food item that you buy, and it's regulated, and what you see can be shared along the various food items that you choose, so you can make some informed decisions about how much you're actually going to take. For instance, if you buy sliced bread in England, it'll tell you exactly how much salt there is in sliced bread. At the moment, we don't have that regulation. It's not required, and maybe it would be useful for the government to insist on this, because it allows us to make decisions. I don't think that banning salt or banning alcohol or banning sugar is going to be a viable solution, but informing people and allowing them to make informed decisions, I think is useful. And of course we've taken some steps with cigarette labeling and tobacco labeling, but to do that one step further with food would be very useful, I think.
All right, there's a lot of questions here for babies as well, around children. So someone asking the same question that the doctors have answered about salt. If I have a 1-year-old and I'm starting to introduce these salts and sugars into their meals, what's the rule when it comes to babies?
So my advice is actually not to introduce any salt into a baby's food. I think generally most babies, if they're not breastfeeding, will be having some kind of formula, and the formula itself contains, in general, a balanced proportion of what it is a baby needs. Some of the mistakes we make as parents, if you like, is that we introduce certain things that maybe as a child we enjoyed. We have bread, but we make sure that there's butter on the bread for the child, or there's salt added into whatever it is, so that the child can enjoy the difference. But once they become used to it, then it becomes a real problem. And salt addiction, fat addiction, carbohydrate addiction, these are real things. So if you can try and avoid it at a young age, it's very
important. Avoid salt altogether till they're what, maybe 3, 4, or what's...
Altogether, there's enough salt in everything that we eat in general that you don't need to add.
We're almost winding up. I'll ask you to add. I don't know if we have any tweets as well, as Dr. Njenga adds. Maybe we can try and see if we can bring the tweets up. Yes.
So just to emphasize on what Dr. Jalen has said, the key thing with watching or being careful as a parent about what your children eat is that we have a significant surge in childhood obesity, and that's a very big concern, because if you have a rise in childhood obesity, and the prevalence of all these lifestyle diseases we're talking about, hypertension, diabetes, are going to occur at a much earlier age. So whereas previously you would see diabetes, for example, occurring at the age of 50, now we're having type 2 diabetes occurring at the age of 20, and right now we have type 2, the youngest person with type 2 diabetes is 2 years of age. Okay. So the key thing is, for example, sodas. So that's one thing that you'd want to kind of restrict or regulate in the younger groups. So like in other countries, they've actually outlawed, for example, vending machines in schools, for example, where the kids are able to access the sodas. In hospitals, for example, it's not, it may not be a good idea to have vending machines available where the kids are there. So try and withdraw or withdraw the temptation from the kids. And even it gets to a point when kids no longer drink water when they're thirsty. For the first thing that they run to is the fridge, and if juice is available, soda is available, that's their first preference, because that's what they prefer. Oh, we're completely out of time. I think I only have room for one more question. Let's see if we can bring something up on Twitter. But fresh juice for babies isn't bad? Okay, before you answer that, it's Alice says, it is advisable to go back to normal diet after the sugars have stabilized for a diabetic. Okay, and the last one, what is the role of multivitamins in diabetics, or for diabetics? Okay. So you can very quickly answer those two. So the diet has to remain as we've described. So even if your blood sugars go back to normal, or you feel you're well controlled, it doesn't mean you can lapse back into going back to liberal eating habits. You still have to watch all your portion of all the food groups that we've discussed about. With regard to multivitamins, we don't routinely prescribe multivitamins in diabetic patients unless there's an indication. So if during the course of the evaluation we find out, for example, if their vitamin D levels are low, then we may substitute that. But in general, we don't normally prescribe multivitamins to all our diabetic patients. Okay. Yes. Dr. Jalan, just before you give your sort of like your parting shot, fresh juices, again going back to babies, if it's fresh orange juice, fresh watermelon juice, is that okay? Because it does have a fair amount of sugar on its own. No, I think a fresh juice, if it's truly a fresh juice, in other words, you don't add any sugar, I think that's reasonable. That's a good option. And it's good to get used to juice and tea and other drinks without added sugar. All right. Your final comments just regarding hypertension and healthy living. I think control is the key statement. Control your diet, increase your activity level if possible, watch your weight, very important, because weight affects bones as well as the heart and other parts of the body. It affects diabetes. Avoid alcohol, or at least if you're going to take alcohol, take it in real moderation, and avoid cigarettes. And in general, manage your stress. And if you can do all of those things, then in general you've done your bit, and the rest is basically is fate, and whatever happens. All right, thank you. Dr. Njenga, your final comments just about diabetes. Yeah, so mine would just be to advocate for screening, not only for diabetes but also for hypertension. So anyone, at least I'd say if you're above the age of 30, at least twice a year at least, have your blood sugar checked, have your blood pressure checked, have your BMI checked, so at least you know where you stand. All right. Because if you catch, like I said, I emphasize again, if you catch pre-diabetes, close to 60% of those individuals can go back to having normal sugars by simple interventions, diet, lifestyle, exercise. All right. Thank you both so much. Very insightful answers there. I think we might need a follow-up at some point because the questions are so many. I think people are very keen about living a healthy lifestyle and just trying to get direction. Stay with Monday Special. We'll be right back after this short break.